Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Expeditions virtual field trip and tour to the Smithsonian Marine Ecosystem Exhibit's Oculina Ecosystem. My name is Jacqueline Durakis, and I'm the Expeditions Manager with EarthEcho International. At EarthEcho, we are a global nonprofit founded on the belief that youth have the power to change our planet. Reaching more than 2 million people in 146 countries, we provide original content, immersive experiences, and trusted resources to empower young people to become leaders and problem solvers in their community and around the world. For today's virtual field trip, I wanted to give you a reminder that you can send in questions for our expert, Laura, and we will answer those throughout today's event. If you are joining in Zoom, please use the Q&A app. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can go ahead and put your questions and comments in the chat space. So I'm so excited to introduce our guest host today, who is Miss Laura Beur. She's the marine science educator at the Smithsonian Marine Station. And I invite you to take it away, Laura.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me for a virtual tour of our Oculina exhibit and of our Oculina ecosystem here at the Smithsonian Marine Ecosystem Exhibit in Fort Pierce, Florida. So if you're joining us from Florida, I wonder if you've ever stopped by and visited us. Please feel free to leave in the Q&A or in the chat and let us know if you've stopped by. But if you haven't, today is your opportunity to get a virtual guided tour of our Oculina ecosystem. What's unique about us here in Fort Pierce at the Smithsonian Marine Ecosystem Exhibit is that we feature model ecosystems. So we have 6 major model ecosystems. And what that means is that we model every single part of what you would see in that ecosystem out in nature. So today, we're going to be talking about our Oculina, which is a species of deep sea coral. So I guess without further ado, we'll just go right ahead and get into it. You put on your virtual goggles and jump right on in with me. So that's right, I did say deep sea corals. So the species is Oculina verrucosa. Like I said before, these species of corals grow in like 200 to 300 feet of water. So there's no sunlight that deep. Corals that are typically found in the Atlantic Ocean, in the tropical Western Atlantic in particular, need sunlight because they have a special relationship with zooxanthellae, which is the bacteria that photosynthesizes for them, and it's how they get a lot of their energy. But these species of corals, they don't need that. They can actually find food on their own, and it comes through in the currents that are down that deep in the water. I'm sitting in front of our diorama of our Oculina habitat, and I'm going to point to a couple of things. But before I do, I just want to mention some really unique facts about these Oculina corals. They're commonly called ivory tree coral, and they're all white because they don't have this relationship with zooxanthellae like our corals in the photic zone or where the sunlight can penetrate. They don't need to have any pigment. So they look just like skeletons, like bones, and that's because they are made out of a similar material. They're made out of calcium carbonate. So they're an animal. I don't know if you guys know corals are an animal. So these animals, like I said, they find food, and they also create very complex structure and habitat for a lot of other animals. The unique thing about these corals here in Florida is that they grow from Fort Pierce north to up around Daytona, Florida. And I'm going to show you a map of what that looks like in just a second. But it's critical habitat for many commercial and recreational fisheries. In the 1970s, when this area was first discovered, there was huge aggregations of spawning grouper. And unfortunately, because of overfishing, there are not as many fish out there anymore. These corals are extremely, extremely fragile, and they are super slow growing. They grow half an inch a year. So they're very susceptible to fishing gear damage. And what I want to show you behind me in the mural, so this is our diorama of the Oculina, and you can see in the picture these mounding sort of structures, and that's the ivory tree coral creating that complex habitat. Now, in a soccer ball size part of the colony, you can find over 500 different kinds of animals. So just to give you some context, a soccer ball size, you can find 500 different species. That's a lot of complex habitat. And you know, there's way more than one soccer ball's worth on these huge Oculina banks. So they mound into these structures, And you can see in the picture, in the painting above, these spawning aggregations of snowy grouper, gag grouper, a couple different species of snapper as well. But you notice, maybe hopefully you can see in this middle section here, there's kind of a large swath that's been a little destroyed. And that's because there's a fishing practice called bottom dredging that drags these heavy chained nets along the bottom. And it kind of just tears up all of the ecosystem and the habitat in its wake. And it's a really destructive fishing practice. And before this area was encountered by scientists, like I said, in the early 70s, nobody knew this habitat was there and that it was so fragile and critical for other animals. So oftentimes you'll see in videos of these areas that a lot of it has been destroyed. What's really interesting is that 200 to 300 feet below sea level is kind of hard for scientists to access. So the way that these areas were discovered was with ROVs, which are also, it's an acronym for remotely operated vehicles. So you can't, divers can dive to that depth, but it takes a lot of safety stops and very specific training to be a technical diver. And it has happened on a few occasions where divers have gone down to collect specimens or to conduct research, but mostly this area is accessed by those remotely operated vehicles that I mentioned. So does anyone have any questions about what you're seeing? I might point out a few animals while I give you some time to ask your questions in the Q&A. But we have here in the middle is a sea cucumber. These are probably the most abundant animal on the sea floor, and they're really important to the ecosystem. They're like vacuum cleaners. They kind of hoover along and pick out things in the sediment and bind it with their poop. We also have some reef butterfly fish. We have, like I mentioned before, our groupers and our snappers. There's some amberjacks. And if you don't mind me panning a little bit over to the right, you'll even see our big giant sunfish, or our mola mola, up there in the top corner, which I know is Jacqueline's favorite fish. So that's a little bit more about the Oculina as an ecosystem out in nature. You guys are going to get a very unique opportunity today to see a few of these fish in our exhibit, and we're going to get to do a feeding in just a little bit. But Jacqueline, do you have any questions?
We sure do. We have a question coming in from YouTube, and the student is asking, how did we find out about these corals if they live in the deep and they're hard to find? How did we first discover them?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So scientists, in partnership with Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute, were out doing an exploration just to kind of understand the sea floor. And they encountered these areas, like I said, in 1975, and they were using remotely operated vehicles. So actually, that's a perfect question to transition us into talking about this area. But they noticed these huge swaths of coral rubble, and they saw these huge mounding structures. And the scientists thought, wow, this is a super unique ecosystem, and we definitely need to do more work to understanding it. So from then on, there's been a lot of work conducted on the east coast of Florida at Smithsonian and at Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute to understand these areas. They, like I said, noticed that it was a super abundant area and critical to a lot of different species. So in 1984, in partners with fishery management, they marked it as a habitat area of particular concern, or HAPC. And what that means is that they halted all of the fishing that was able to happen there until they could understand more of what was going on and to continue doing research to understanding the ecosystem more fully. What's really unique is that in 1994, they expanded that protection to being over 300 nautical miles, which is a little bit more than 300 square miles, so I apologize for that in the slide. So this, I don't know if you guys have paid attention to some of the other EarthEcho talks, but the 30 by 30, so protecting 30% of our world's oceans by 2030, this 300 square miles right off the coast of Fort Pierce up through Daytona is a huge chunk of area that is now protected, which is super great to see, especially because, like I said, these corals are so fragile and they're so slow growing that they're really susceptible to damage from fishing gear. When they expanded the area, At the bottom of that yellow strip on the map, there's an area that's called the Oculina Experimental Zone, and that is completely off limits to any fishing practices. There is a couple different kinds of fishing that are allowed in the larger area, but there's absolutely no fishing in the experimental section, and that's because scientists are trying to understand the growth of the grouper as well as some of the other species. So what's really unique too is that restoration efforts began. So scientists recognized that these areas were devastated by fishing practices, but they wanted to know, like, is there anything that we could do to help sort of restore that habitat complexity and make the area stronger and better off for the future? And they tried a couple different things, but one of the successful things that they've done is create these reef balls. So in the corner of this slide, you'll see, kind of a bizarre looking shape. It's concrete block with a little float on it. And they would secure parts of these corals to those reef balls and then submerge them to depth. And in our mural, in our diorama, you might be actually able to see a mock of one of those. And you'll see one in our ecosystem as well. So I'll make sure to point that out when we get over there. But the good news about the restoration efforts is that they have been successful. I don't have exactly percentages offhand, but these reef balls have been growing coral in the areas that have been degraded because it keeps the coral up off the ground. Like I said before, they need to feed, so they need good water current passing them by. And if they're broken on the seafloor, they're not necessarily getting that, and they're not able to thrive and to grow into larger colonies. So keeping them up off the ground on these structures is really important to produce more coral and healthier corals.
That's awesome. So Laura, some of our students watching on YouTube, well, first of all, they thought maybe the reef ball in the diorama looked like a skull. So I think we're thinking of spooky things right now in October. But I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more how and why the reef balls. We have a lot of questions about what they are. I'm going to pull up that picture one more time if you want to talk about them.
Sure, yeah. So if you look closely in the picture, you'll see this three-dimensional concrete shape. The concrete or cement is similar enough of a substrate that the corals will grow over it in time. So what's unique about coral and quite a few other species as well, when you break off a piece, if it's secured to a substrate, it will start to grow a new colony. And this is a very common practice in a lot of coral restoration programs. And Oculina verrucosa is no different. So they'll fragment these pieces. And also, I should say, corals do this naturally in the ocean. So when big storms come through and they sometimes snap off pieces of the coral, if they land in a good spot and they get wedged into the reef, they'll start to grow a new colony. So this is a totally natural thing that corals do. So the coral reef balls, by fragmenting those corals and affixing them to that structure, when they sink that to the bottom, to the seafloor, to 200 to 300 feet where these corals are found, after some time, the corals will start to grow over the reef ball, and it restores some of the complexity that's lost in these large swaths. So you can kind of see in the diorama, I hope that you can, but we have these mounding structures that are growing up and up. And this is what like a healthy Oculina reef should look like. Very large. As it grows over time, they form what they call them Oculina banks because they're such large structures. But when that's removed, like I said, you have these almost tractor marks, or like when you take a lawnmower through fresh, like tall grass, there's nothing there except the seafloor and some of the coral rubble that was broken off. But if it's not, like I said, up in the water column where it can get food from stuff that's falling as marine snow or from the water currents, it will just die. So that's what that coral rubble is, just to sort of simulate. So what's unique about the reef ball is, A, the coral will grow on it and grow over it until it forms a new mounding structure, just like if there was exposed, like our limestone bedrock here in Florida. It keeps the coral up off the ground so that it can get that water flow, and it has hidey holes in it. A, that helps it sink a little bit better, but B, those hidey holes, a lot of invertebrates or different critters can get in there and find protection from predators. So that restores some of the habitat complexity. I know I keep using that word a lot, but it's very complex, and it's basically all it means is it's nooks and crannies. So if you were a tiny little shrimp out on this reef, and there was nowhere for you to hide, you'd get slurped up by one of the big snappers. But if there's all these nooks and crannies for you to tuck into, and you can find food and then hide, there's going to be way more shrimp out there as a food source, and for all the other animals as well.
So another question that we have coming in from Asher and Haven, who are 5 years old, and they're watching us from Canada. Hi. They would like to know, how many years would it take for the reef ball, the concrete ball, to be covered in coral and have a full colony grown? And I want to give them a shout out for using that word colony too.
Yes, that is a great, great question. So thank you so much for asking it. I wish I could tell you exactly the answer. Like, it takes this long for it to be a colony. And that's exactly the right word. Colony is what these big corals are. But like I said before, the corals only grow a ½ inch a year. So if you take, you guys do the math. I'm not good at math. But if you take like an inch piece of coral, usually they're bigger, like about palm size. So let's say your coral is 10 inches in size, and it only grows a ½ inch a year. And these reef balls can be like 3 square feet. Well, they're round, so they wouldn't be square feet, but in diameter. How long would it take? Let us know in the comments. I'm not great at math, and I don't have a calculator.
I'm not great at math either.
To give you just a short answer. So they are slow growing corals, and it does take some time. So some of these reef balls were put down, obviously not in our diorama, in 1996, and it's 2020 now, and they are starting to show success. When they go back and monitor them again with those remotely operated vehicles, they're noticing that the colonies are growing larger and growing over that reef ball. So that's how they measure success in these structures.
Great, thank you. That was a great question and great answer. So I hope I'm saying your name right, but we have a question from Narika Patel, and they would like to know, how can the fish live by their own on this deep sea reef? So how do they survive by themselves?
That's a great question. There's many different species of fish. The oceans are full of diverse species, and they all have adapted and evolved very unique either behaviors or mechanisms to help them thrive. So some of the fish that we see out on the Oculina banks in this deep of water, and actually that's a great question to set us up for transitioning over to our feeding in just a second. And I'll talk about a few of those because you'll get to see them in person. But these fish have adaptations that make them suited to their environment. So the grouper and the snapper are very fast swimmers, and they have large mouths, and they're excellent eaters. So that's what makes them survive really well in these habitats. Some of the other animals have camouflaging, so they either will blend in with their surroundings, kind of like what octopus do, or they're just built to have the same sort of coloration as their habitats. So in this area where the corals are white, a lot of the animals are translucent, or they're lighter or paler in color. Also keep in mind though, it helps them camouflage in. We're seeing this area in bright natural light. Now, when we flip over and I show you our ecosystem, at first it's going to be very dark because we model that just like you would find in the habitat. But we do have to open up the top so that we can feed the animals and show you a little bit more about them. But you wouldn't really be able to see. So some of these creatures have adapted ways to either having big eyes so that they can capture as much light as is in that level and hunt and feed. Some animals bioluminesce, so they light up or glow, which is really cool, and that's how they communicate with each other or get away and confuse predators. And I think your question is such a good one, and I could go on and on and on about all the different adaptations. But I think if there's a particular fish that you're curious about, I encourage you to look it up and see if you can find some adaptations for yourself, because there's so many, and that's what makes the deep sea so cool.
So Laura, Adam had a question, and that is, how deep is the ocean?
Ooh, Adam, that's a great, great question. In this area of Florida, we're still on sort of the shelf. So these are on the seafloor at like 200 to 300 meters. But there are parts of the ocean that get even deeper. In the Marianas Trench, which is one of the largest areas of the ocean, I mean, you could fit Mount Everest in there upside down.
Very deep, but it depends where you are, right? So sometimes it's very shallow, sometimes it's very deep. The ocean is always dynamic. So my nephew is watching us from Ohio, and his name is Peyton, and he would like to know, what is the most dangerous fish that could live on the Oculina banks?
Ooh, Peyton, great question. The most dangerous fish. Well, I think well, you know what? I'll tell you exactly what the most dangerous fish is. And it's not native, and that's why it's dangerous. So in these areas, we're starting to find lionfish, which are an invasive species. They're originally from the Indo-Pacific. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of them for you because I wasn't, oh, Jacqueline's going to pull one up. Great. So we'll show you a photo of what a lionfish looks like. Like I said, these fish are invasive. They're not from this area. They have started breeding and reproducing, and they're very, I mean, they're all over the place now, and they're venomous. So if our species of grouper were to try and eat them, they would get poked by a spine and almost like a wasp sting. It feels very nasty, but they're not poisonous. So they make a delicious fillet. If you've ever had lionfish, let us know in the chat, because it's one of my favorite things to have for tacos and ceviche. It's delicious. But they're dangerous because they are not from here. They're not from this area. So a lot of our fish don't recognize them as a predator or as a prey item. So this is the fish. It's gorgeous. It's a gorgeous fish. The spines on the top, and there's some spines on the bottom ventrally that are those venomous spines that I mentioned. And you'll notice they have this big, big mouth, and they slurp up prey super quick. They eat shrimp and crustaceans, really anything that they can fit into their mouth. And they have a voracious appetite, which means that they are always hungry. I've seen lionfish eat until little fish tails are sticking out of their mouths. They just will keep eating and eating and eating. And they are kind of tearing up our local species communities because our juvenile fish don't recognize them, like I said, as a predator. They haven't learned and adapted with this species or evolved with the species. So that is, in my opinion, the most dangerous fish. And you can find those lionfish at 300 feet below sea level. They will live almost anywhere.
Wow, well, thank you so much. So we do have some guesses coming in for how many years it would take for the coral to cover the reef ball. And they range from 20 to 36. But I think it might be a little bit more than that, maybe.
I think it might be even more. I think 36 is a good guess to start seeing some of that growth and understanding that this experiment was a success. But to cover up that reef ball, it could take 50 to 100 years.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
Right. So we'll let you transition over because we're going to get to see the exhibit now in a live feeding. But while Laura is switching over, I just wanted to share with you all that we have lots of free educator resources. The Smithsonian, and specifically the Smithsonian Marine Station, has free resources available online, as well as EarthEcho. So we have resources talking about corals, overfishing, and lots of different environmental issues. So we encourage you all to check them out today.
Okay.
All right, so we're getting set up here so we can get a nice view. Remember, if you're watching, questions, you can enter them in the Q&A app here in Zoom or in the YouTube chat. We get a good angle here.
Sorry about the jerking around.
You're
so
okay.
We're seeing some food go in. So I should just say, this is our Oculina model ecosystem. So you'll notice it's kind of dark. And like I said, this is a deep 200, 300 meter area. And these fish are exactly the fish that you would see in that ecosystem. Now you'll notice we do have a little reef ball here. We don't have any corals affixed to it. And that's because in this exhibit, these corals, they're real skeletons. So they're not alive. And that's because we have some fish in here that actually eat coral, and we don't want them to pick at the coral and it will get like a disease. So these corals are skeletons from the Oculina banks. They were brought to us by researchers at Harbor Branch so we could feature them in our exhibit. Now, Katie, our aquarist, has just put in some food for these fish, and today they're feeding on PE mysis, which is a tiny little shrimp, almost like a zooplankton or something that would be found in the water column, and it sort of drifts down through the water, just like you would find in that ecosystem. Now, Katie's arm you might see in the exhibit with a turkey baster, and Katie's target feeding are basket stars. So hopefully these are sea stars that have complex structural arms, and if that butterfly fish would get out of the way, you might be able to see. It is kind of tricky because of how dark the exhibit is, but Katie's targeting those basket sea stars to make sure that they are well fed as well. We do have one of my favorite fish over here tucked in the corner. This is our short big eye. So you'll notice that this fish is red with a huge, large eye. Like I said, those are one of those adaptations. And a lot of the fish you'll notice are orangey or red or yellows. And there's an interesting reason for that. So in the water column, when light is absorbed by water, red is one of the first wavelengths that gets absorbed. So you won't see the color red anymore. It gets picked up by the blues and the greens that are the undertones. So you're like, why, Laura, why are all these fish red then if you wouldn't even be able to see the color red this deep in the water column? And that's exactly why. So these red fish would look like kind of a gray blob, and it helps them camouflage and be sneaky around other prey or predator items. Now, the short big eye, you didn't get to see it feed because it's being sassy and hiding in a corner today, but it has a very large mouth that's upturned, almost like a big frowny face. And the reason is because it sneaks up under prey and gobbles them up.
So Laura, we have some comments coming in, and one is from Cindy in North Dakota, and she says that this makes her miss having her home aquarium. And then we have a lot of questions coming in about fish. So I'm going to give them to you kind of all at once, if that's okay. So
sure, yeah, go ahead, but just keep in mind that I'm not a fish expert. I'll do my best to answer them.
No worries. So Anya wants to know, what is the most aggressive fish? So maybe you can talk about one of the fish that we're seeing here. How long do fish live? And then what do you think is the strangest fish?
Ooh, the strangest fish. So in terms of aggressive fish, it really varies on habitat, but I will mention in this exhibit, so all of these fish have lived here for a long time together, and we keep them well fed. They get fed 3 times a day so that they're not eating each other. It's kind of funny, and people will probably expect me to say that the most aggressive fish is the short big eye, but actually it's one of the reef fish, which is this little one here in the center that has the yellow tail. And the reason is that it will like nip. The reason we can't have live coral is because it will just continue nipping at it. It's its preferred food source in the ocean. And so it will just keep picking, and it would be, uncomfortable for the coral over time if we had live coral in this exhibit. So not necessarily what you think of in terms of the most aggressive, but it can be kind of a nuisance in regards to the coral. And you can see it, like it's feeding on the shrimp, but it's going to like peck at the coral skeleton, which is what it would do in the wild. They'll also eat free floating things like in the current, which is what we're feeding them, but it loves to just take little nips of the coral's polyps.
So Laura, earlier you mentioned the basket sea star.
Yeah.
Can you explain why you called it a sea star and not a starfish, please?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's some conversation in the scientific community that starfish, they're not actually fish, they're echinoderms. So they're related to sea cucumbers and sea urchins. So I just use what scientists prefer, in that just to call them sea star and not starfish, because they aren't a fish. And they're called basket sea stars because when they you can't really see this one super well because it's not extended in the water column, but when they open up all their arms to filter feed, they look like a big basket on the reef. So the arms will open like this, and they'll kind of grab food out of the water and bring it to the mouth, which is in the center.
Fabulous. So Vanden would like to know, what is the largest fish in the sea?
Ooh, what is the largest fish? I mean, it's got to be a whale shark, right?
I think so. I think
because sharks are technically bony, they're chondrichthyes, they're cartilaginous fish. Whale sharks are technically the largest fish.
And then correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the mola that you showed us in the diorama is the largest bony fish.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I think
and then Mason would like to know, what is the orange fish that is swimming around? So the kind of smaller, they're orange. Oh, now he swam away, of course. Oh, there he is. Oh, kind of near the basket star there.
Sure. Yeah. Let me go over a couple of the fish in this exhibit, and I'll tell you their names. So like I mentioned, this large orange or red fish here is called the short big eye. And they are, it has that very big eye, which is a telltale characteristic of nocturnal and deep water fish. This one up here, sorry, I'm trying to circle them out. This is one of our red barbiers, and we have two in this exhibit, and they're members of the bass family. And you can sometimes find them more than 1,800 feet deep in the ocean. Males are identified both as really long dorsal fins. So these two are females on the top, the smaller, more oval shaped. And this one here is a male because it has that long, I don't know if you can see on the dorsal. And then we also have a wrasse bass, which is hiding right now, of course, as I'm talking about it. It's sort of, it's the longer shaped fish with the dark red bar down the body, and then two sort of lighter yellow stripes on it. Usually you'll find it hanging out along the bottom. You may have seen it come out for the feeding. But they're also a bass species, and they can be found greater than 80 feet, but they're rarely seen because they're very secretive. So you saw it come out for the feeding, and unless you were to stand really quiet in front of this exhibit for some time, you might not see it again because it hangs out tucked into these nooks and crannies. And then last but not least, the fish that I mentioned a couple times, that beautiful spot fin butterfly fish. There's a black spot. It's kind of, you might not be able to see it on camera, on the dorsal fin, and there's a bar, that dark bar through its eye. These are characteristic of butterfly fish, but it fools the predators into thinking that the eye on the, sorry, I keep like pointing over here, but there's an eye here on the tail end. And if you were a big predator and you saw that eye spot, you'd think the fish was going to go this way, and it's really going that way. So it's a way that it helps it evade predation. We also have, it's again difficult to see, so I apologize. We have our basket sea star, which I mentioned, but we also have a couple other sea stars in here. We have a spiny sea star, which is usually hangs out on the top of the tank feeding on things on the glass. And then I don't know if you can see, there's this orange sort of spot here, and that's our unnamed sea star. And that's its actual name. This is our wrasse bass here peeking out. I don't know if you guys can see. That's yes, the wrasse bass. So it kind of hangs out tucked into, like I said, those nooks and crannies. But you got to see it. It's a really unique fish.
That's incredible. And we can see that unnamed sea star too.
Okay, great. And that's literally its name. Scientists, sometimes they are on very long research expeditions and they kind of run out of their creativity. And so, I mean, it has a scientific name, but its common name is unnamed sea star.
That's awesome. So for those watching who are little budding marine biologists and ecologists, if they discover a new species, will they get to name it?
For sure, yeah. So usually you're not allowed to name things after yourself. That's kind of common practice in, in the nomenclature of when you discover a new species. But the deep sea, there's tons of stuff that keeps being discovered every year. And as technology improves, I mentioned before about our remotely operated vehicles are what we use to explore these areas. And as we have more and more technological advances with the remotely operated vehicles and what they're able to do, species get identified all the time. So you can name it really whatever you like, but like I said, you just can't name it after yourself. So you have to be friends with someone who's naming other animals to get one named after you.
That's great advice. I love that. So, Laura, earlier you mentioned that some fishing practices like dredging can disturb the bottom and essentially kill these corals in this habitat. What can our viewers do at home to kind of help these corals and these habitats be healthy and safe underneath the water in the deep sea?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Jacqueline. So I appreciate you for asking, because I think it's really important that people understand where their fish is coming from. So one of the easiest things you can do, there's an app you can download, and it will tell you like what fish is a good fish to eat, because not all species are properly managed. And just ask your server, like when you order fish at a restaurant or if you're buying fish from the grocery store, look and see where it's coming from. And I think the best way to, if you were really passionate like I am about these areas, oh, thank you. So Jacqueline shared the link with you. It's seafoodwatch.org. But get to know your fishermen. Go to a local, if it's accessible to you, and even your local grocery store, just get to know your seafood counter clerk a little bit better, and they'll be able to give you some more information. And I think one of the first places to start, if you care really about, if you care about these things, is just start asking questions like, where did this fish come from? What is the practice that it was harvested by? Because there are some fish that are really, they're just not properly managed. And if anything is caught by dredging, I would recommend finding something else. But getting a good relationship with your local fisherman and your local fish shop is a good place to start.
I agree. That's great advice. And just to kind of tag on to that, I would encourage everybody to talk to their friends and families too. So if you go out to dinner and maybe your friend orders something, talk to them about it. Do you know where that came from? Do you know how that was caught? And I find that sometimes just by talking about these things that we eat, it opens up our eyes and we're able to make some changes for the better.
And sometimes too, like, it's probably not what everyone wants to hear, but sometimes you do have to give some things up just because they're not sustainably caught. Like, I don't really eat shrimp anymore from the Gulf of Mexico because those shrimp nets can be very damaging to the ecosystem. But it's everyone's personal preference, and it's where you have to meet people where they're at in their journeys. So I miss it. I love shrimp and grits. I'm from the South. It's very important to me. But unless I can get sustainably caught shrimp, I am not interested.
That's awesome. Good for you. You're making a difference for sure. All right. Well, Laura, thank you so much. We had some great questions and great chat today. So everyone was really into this, and we're so happy we could see the exhibit and see them getting their lunch, I suppose. So thank you so much. And I know that you were kind enough to share the Smithsonian Marine Station's social media. So we want to make sure everybody goes and follows along with your adventures. And you were even nice enough to add an email. So if anyone has any questions after today or questions that we didn't get to, please make sure to reach out.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Jacqueline. We have a lot of, if you're a parent or a teacher, make sure to follow up with us. Facebook or our email is a good place. We have a ton of really cool educational resources about the exhibits and about what we've got going on here. And if you're in Florida in the Fort Pierce area, we are open to the public. So try and come visit us.
Definitely. I've been before and it's great. So I highly recommend a trip over to the Marine Station. I also like to encourage everybody to follow along with EarthEcho and our adventures. So you can follow all of our socials here. And if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe so you can get alerts when we go live, like today's awesome virtual field trip. And we hope to see you again in the future. So thank you all for joining us today. We hope you have a great day and stay safe and keep exploring. Bye.
Bye.